So it's something that I felt really needed to be thought about, because if you don't solve this question for yourself, what is it that you're doing? How do you know that you're doing something good? My point is rather that a neural code, doesn't have the properties that would make it a good representation or meaningful representation for an organism.
Isn't it wild that we can do so much under such false assumptions and metaphors?
That's a difficult question. I mean, yes and no, we've made progress, but what kind of progress?
Well, we can...
I still personally have no idea what perception is.
This is Brain Inspired.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to Brain Inspired. I'm Paul Middlebrooks. This episode, I spoke with Romain Brette, or if you're into more American bastardizations of French names, Romain Brette. He's a theoretical neuroscientist and the research director in computational and theoretical neuroscience in the Vision Institute, which is in Paris. In this episode, we start off talking about theory versus modeling versus experiment, but then we get into topics from his article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which encompasses much of what he's been thinking about and writing about for over a decade now, through blogging and various other published articles. The paper is called, "Is Coding a Relevant Metaphor for the Brain?" And the central claim is that we misuse the term code when we talk about a neural code and its relevance to the organism and to the organism's brain that is said to be encoding things in the world. There's an important difference between a brain's perspective and our perspective as an outside observer, giving those brains tasks to perform. And when we try to understand how some neural activity relates to the task, we use our own perspective rather than the brain's perspective. But we talk as if we're using the brain's perspective. Hopefully that will become clearer in our discussion. That discussion includes topics like various notions of information, representation and its various roles and properties. We get into process metaphysics versus substance metaphysics. So lots to think about here. And before that, we get into the interesting and unique experience of writing a behavioral and brain sciences article. I link to the relevant material at braininspired.co/podcast/79. If you value this podcast and you want to support it and hear the full versions of all the episodes and occasional separate bonus episodes, you can do that for next to nothing through Patreon. Go to braininspired.co and click the red Patreon button there. If you take one thing away from this episode today, I think the thing to take away is something that Romain has done that I would strongly recommend you implement if you can, and that is to set aside some block of time every week to ponder the meaning and implications of whatever you're doing, its validity, and so forth. That's what I think, and Romain is a real testament to how that kind of practice can pay off. So I wish that for you. Romain, thanks for joining me on the show, and good late afternoon to you. I know it's late afternoon in your world.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you have a really broad range of interests, from spike initiation, how spikes are initiated in neurons, all the way up to broad philosophical issues in the theoretical neuroscience world. But I'd love to hear just how you characterize your interests.
That's a difficult question.
Maybe another way to ask it is, not many people cover both the theoretical side and broad philosophical questions, which you cover in essays on your blog and in published manuscripts, and also getting down to the nitty-gritty of spike initiation, for instance. So I wonder maybe where these interests came from, if you've always had such a broad array of interests, or if it's sort of developed, the theoretical and epistemological side has developed over time, or if it went the other way.
Yeah, so epistemological aspect of my work has developed fairly recently. I mean, maybe 10 years ago. I don't know, maybe from reflection on my own work and out of frustration.
Yeah, what do you mean?
Something like that.
What's the frustration? What was the frustration?
You know, I've been working a little bit on some systems neuroscience, specifically on audition, sound localization, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, at some point, I felt a little frustrated that I was wondering whether we were making any progress, really. You know, it felt like writing papers were like kind of rhetorical exercises. And so that was the frustration. At some point, I felt that I needed to take some time to think about what it is that we're doing and what's the meaning.
But I think a lot of people feel that way. I felt that way. But so there's progress writ large in neuroscience, and there's also personal progress. And when you're doing the rhetorical exercise of writing a paper, that paper is progressing your career, presumably, or that's the hope. And then you also have 3 other papers in the background waiting to be written. And so one can hardly take the time to think, well, now I'm going to step back and consider these larger issues and work on them. I don't think many people feel the luxury of time to do that. How did you manage that?
That's an interesting question. I don't think it's a luxury, but it's something that doesn't come naturally, in the sense that we're always involved in various projects, and typically we don't really have time to really think deeply about philosophical issues or conceptual issues. And so for me, what I decided to do is just take one day off. I mean, off the normal work.
Yeah.
To just take time to think about things independently of any paper or project or whatever. Just take some time to, in my case, it was time I took to write my blog. So every Wednesday, I would take the day to just think about whatever I felt I wanted to think about and write something about it. Yeah, so I did that on different subjects. It's still on my blog. So
yeah,
some on perception, quite a bit on perception. Some more general about philosophy of science. Things like what's a good model, things like that.
Yeah.
I said actually, I mentioned that this came out of frustration a little bit. So part of it was scientific frustration, but also the frustration that you experience when you're a theoretician in a very empirical field, and like biology. That is that many biologists, they don't really understand what theory is and what it's for, what's the use of it, and there's a lot of confusion between theory and running a model. Making a simulation that's not the same thing.
They're conflated often, yeah, in the biological realm. Yeah.
Yeah.
The model is the theory, for instance.
Yes. Right. But a simulation is not an explanation. And in theory, what you look for is explanations. And that's not the same thing. But then, this is something probably many people like me have experienced. You have to explain. It is your responsibility to explain why your model, your theory is good or not. But what does it mean? It turns out it's not at all an easy question to answer, in fact. What's a plausible model, for example? You have this phrase, biologically plausible. I never quite understood what it meant. What's biologically plausible? Does it mean that you have to name it a neuron? It has to have channels. What's that?
Right.
It's not easy, and there are different. You can see in the field that there are very different perspectives on this. You have, broadly characterized. You have this. You have bottom up and top down approaches, or you have normative approaches. You start from a problem, typically a computational problem. That would be a David Mars approach. And then you think of how this problem might be solved, and then you look for an implementation in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
That's one theoretical approach. And you have other approaches to developing theory, which starts from looking at the properties of neurons, measured properties and things like that. And then you try to understand what maybe emergent properties of these components and things like that. And I don't think either of these approaches is fully satisfying. But just to say that there are different approaches actually to what modeling is, what good modeling is, and I don't think people agree on that. So it's something that I felt really needed to be thought about, because if you don't solve this question for yourself, what is it that you're doing? How do you know that you're doing something good?
Yeah.
So I think it was an important thing to do.
But one can come to a place where it reduces the rate of your experimental work to zero, because you realize that almost everything you're doing has no firm ground upon which to stand. And then where do you go? Do you just leave experimental biology or neuroscience completely? Or do you somehow bring the theory in and fix the experimental problems that you're working on? These things are very abstract that I'm saying right now, I know, but the worry is that your productive work in the lab will just come to a screeching halt if you really had to consider all the theoretical issues, because it's still all so up in the air. So you manage to continue on. So, but just in your head, do you ever think, well, I need to not do any experimentation and just consider these larger questions, because they're the bigger questions that are ultimately going to be the roadblock we need to get past?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think different approaches have value. You can just sit on your chair and think about theoretical questions, and it can be valuable. It can, not necessarily is, but it can be valuable. But what I think is also very valuable is an approach in which you don't necessarily distinguish theory and experiment as different kinds of activities. And I think that's, I don't think experimental science actually exists as something completely isolated.
It shouldn't anyway.
It's not just that it shouldn't, it's that it doesn't. Because every time you do an experiment, even a measurement, you're doing it because you have some idea in mind. You're doing it because you're either trying to prove something or you're looking in some direction. And that is to some extent theoretical. It's just that you might not make it explicit to yourself. But all science is theoretical to some extent. You're trying to answer some questions. You're not just trying to just report an anecdote. So
Sure.
Any empirical science is to some extent theoretical, but and for these reasons, I think it's valuable if you think about the theory that is implicit in your scientific activity, and then if you make it explicit, you might have a chance to question it and to make progress on that.
Another aspect of this is that, so, for instance, we're going to talk about your behavioral and brain science paper, which relates to a lot of your other thoughts and work here. But when you start reading something like that about whether coding is a relevant metaphor for the brain, then you can really go down the rabbit hole and you end up in some philosophically deep waters. And we only have a limited number of hours in the day. I mean, you have a family, I know. I have a family. We have obligations to the world. Sometimes we have to shave. I haven't in a while, and things like that. Sometimes we have to shower. But then you can spend all your time just going down the philosophical road. And I think it's really valuable to, at some point, you have to resurface and make some sort of progress with that theoretical background. But it's really tempting to just keep swimming in the philosophical waters. it seems to be a difficult balance. Do you think that we have the right balance right now between theory and experiment in neuroscience and in, the study of intelligence, a larger picture?
It's a difficult question because first it depends what is meant by theory. Yeah, so what is meant by theory? I mean, there is quite a bit of theory in neuroscience.
But I think that you go to a typical neuroscience lab and it is vastly experimental with theory sort of in the background.
No, that's true. That's certainly true. I mean, biology in general, not just neuroscience, is very empirical generally. The question is what kind of theory we need. I see quite a bit of, a lot of modeling, developing models and data analysis a lot these days, particularly.
These days, yeah.
Because we have more data than before, maybe. But to me, that's not really theory. That's not what I would call theory. Theory, I don't know. I would give an example of theory. Theory would be Darwin's theory of evolution. That would be kind of the main theory in biology. And it's not mathematical necessarily.
Right.
But it's theoretical in the sense that it's broad. It's supposed to explain things that are general. And this kind of theory, I don't think there is so much of it in neuroscience, in biology.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also because it's very difficult to develop this kind of theory. So the balance between theory and experiment, I don't know. It's a difficult question because there's not a single kind of theory. And at the same time, I'm not sure the question is well framed anyway. Sorry.
That's great. Here we go. This is what I'm talking about, though. Because every step of the way, you have to think, well, is it even the right question? And which is, what we're going to talk about with the coding metaphor as well.
Yeah.
In a few minutes. So,
for example, there's I've been trying to write a book on excitability and action potentials. And by doing that, I've read a lot of old papers from the 50s and 60s and so on.
Like Hodgkin-Huxley type?
Exactly, Hodgkin-Huxley. And it's really fascinating when you really read those papers. Hodgkin, he was doing the maths and the physiology, right? And the physics. And when you read the papers, you can see that his understanding of the physics is really deep, actually. And at the same time, obviously, his understanding of physiology is very good as well. And the kind of theory he was making was really indistinguishable from his empirical work, I think. So it's a kind of scientific activity which you cannot categorize as either theory or experiment.
Yeah, I don't. Do we even need to think of Hodgkin-Huxley work as theoretical because it is so just descriptive of the physiological processes?
Well, there definitely is some theoretical development, that's for sure, of the ionic theory of excitability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, nowadays we think about this work and it's just things that we read in textbooks, and we don't realize that 70 years ago. It was not at all obvious that there were ions passing through channels, little holes in membranes and things like that. So all that they had to imagine based on a number of clues and to contrast them with other hypotheses which existed at the time and which we just don't discuss anymore so much now.
That's right.
So there was definitely a strong theoretical development there. And their experiments were there to further develop the theory. Yeah, so that was an interesting balance, even though I don't think balance is really the right word. It's really the interaction that is interesting.
But in that case, so model fits right in between theory and experiment in that case, right? That's where sort of modeling, it didn't begin, obviously, with Hodgkin and Huxley, but that's a quintessential very early model. These days, models are ubiquitous. And when I say you walk into a neuroscience lab and typically it's mostly experiment, I actually include modeling in that these days because everyone has a model. the model experiment loop, but then the theory connects almost to the model, which then connects to the experiment. And then there's the, quicker loop with modeling and experimenting. And I almost consider those one thing at this point.
So in the case of Hodgkin and Huxley, they use the model to, as a tool to try to confirm the theory or to develop the theory.
Yeah.
But nowadays, when we use a Hodgkin-Huxley model, we don't do theory.
That's right. Yeah.
We don't do theory. We take the model, we say, well, a neuron works in this way, and I've made these measurements, I put them in the model, and I simulate it. But at the time, it wasn't like that. It was, I will make the hypothesis that the membrane is permeable to sodium, and so let's say that this current is, I model this current in this way. I put this all together, and if I do this, I can see that the different measurements I make are coherent, basically, and that's how the model is used. And it's not the same thing to. It's completely different from the data-driven approach where you measure a bunch of stuff and you put them in a model and you expect that by simulating it, something new will come that you haven't measured. But that's not developing theory. Maybe that's using some theory, for sure. Mm-hmm. But the model here is not used to develop theory. But it can be used to develop theory.
What I had intended to ask you about and to focus on is your behavioral and brain sciences paper is coding a relevant metaphor for the brain. And just before we step into talking about this, I actually want to ask you about the experience of writing a behavioral and brain sciences paper briefly, because the idea of this type of journal, of this type of article is wonderful. So for those who aren't familiar, the idea is that someone like you, Romain, writes a piece, writes an article, and then there's an open peer commentary section where I don't know how many commentaries were there? 20?
25, 26,
25.
Something like that.
Yeah, so it's a lot of commentaries can then be written in response to the quote-unquote target article, and then the original author of the target article can then respond to those responses. And in principle, I love this idea because, it's open. You get to see everyone's thoughts about the target article, for instance. But in practice, even reading it, I find it extremely frustrating often because the open peer commentary is, I would say more often than not so much focused on the target article, but instead in advancing their own theoretical perspective and their own ideas. And some hardly touch on any of the issues in the target article and instead just jump to whatever they want to be talking about at the time and use the smallest little bit of the target article to then be able to write about whatever they want to write about. And many people don't, actually. There's some great commentaries that are very specifically focused on the target article. But I wonder what your experience was like writing that, and if you agree with my assessment. And I honestly don't know what the open peer commentary instructions are to the commentators, if it is to focus on the target article specifically or to use that as a bridge to whatever the hell you want to talk about or whatever. So I just wonder about your experience with that.
Yeah. Writing this paper took me a lot of time.
But it's built off of a lot of previous work and blog articles, which maybe that's part of the time you're referring to.
Yeah, well, actually, I started writing this paper maybe 8 years ago or something like that.
Wow, yeah.
But I had it read by a couple of people, and then I buried it because I thought, I don't know, I thought it would be quite controversial. I would make lots of enemies and for no good outcome. I was very hesitant to actually publish it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why at some point I decided I should get it out. But anyway, I rewrote it completely and I decided to send it to this journal, which is really a great journal. I've read a number of papers in that journal which are really cool. I mean, the format that you described is very interesting. I find it extremely valuable to have these commentaries that normally you would see nowhere in response to papers. So so that was interesting. The process itself was a little bit painful, I have to say. It took maybe 2 years, I think.
From submission to then get commentary and then respond to the commentary.
And publication.
Yeah, Jesus.
And because, these commentaries come after a standard formal peer review. And in my case, I had, I think, maybe 7 reviewers, at least. Don't remember exactly.
Wow.
A very large number of reviewers, and because in
a typical, so just to state it, a typical, neuroscience paper, for instance, has 3 reviewers or so.
Right. Yeah. Or 2. Or exactly.
2 or 3. Yeah.
In this, so I don't know if it's actually usual for BBS, but in this case, I think the paper was very polarizing. That is, there were reviews that are really completely different in terms of appreciation of the paper. Some say that it was complete nonsense, and others really thought it was insightful. So that was not easy to respond to these reviews. I basically rewrote the paper. And
you're talking about the initial reviews of the 7 reviewers?
Yeah, the initial reviews.
These are what you're talking about? Okay.
Yeah. And then it took a lot of time as well. And then it took a lot of time for them to respond. One of the reviewers flipped. It was positive and then negative. And then I had more reviewers. And basically the reviewers were very split. But in the end, the editor decided that maybe that was the kind of papers that the journal was looking for. Something that is a bit, that creates some controversy. Yeah. And then the commentary process. I don't think there are particular instructions actually for commentaries.
Okay.
They don't have to be criticisms of the paper. They can be just commentaries on a few points that are just touched by the paper and that people want to expand on. For example, it's quite free, and people make proposals for commentaries.
Oh, I see.
Which the editor selects. So in this case, I haven't seen the proposal. I don't know who proposed a commentary, but that was maybe, I don't remember exactly how many.
So there are some commenters who are invited and some who then propose. Okay.
So you sent a 1-page proposal, something like that, for the commentary, where you, not even that, half a page, where you explain what points you want to comment on, also what's your personal expertise and things like that. And the editor selects based on, in order to have some diversity in the views, mainly, I think. And so I think there were, I don't know, maybe 70 submissions or a lot of submissions.
Whoa.
Yeah, a lot of submissions. But I didn't get to see them. I saw only the commentaries that were invited. And it was an interesting process to respond to this commentary. Very unusual because you have to make one response to 25 people.
Yeah.
And it's a bit difficult to make something that is readable.
Yeah, because you have to summarize so many different people's points of view and integrate it and lump 15 of them together in one respect and then 20 together in another. And
But it was interesting because it, in the process, it made me formalize some new points, basically. So I think the response is valuable too. It brings some different points than the main paper.
I agree with you, and I think that it's super valuable for you, the writer. That's most valuable for you, but for the reader, it's a taxing endeavor to read because you read the main paper, which it's putting forth ideas, and as the reader, you're trying to assimilate these ideas into your own worldview, and then think critically about it, and then you read all of the reviews if you're so inclined, and when you read reviews whose authors seem only to write to advance their own agenda and not even to address issues in the article or not even to compare their own agenda with statements in the article, then it becomes extremely frustrated because you've already spent so much time on this thing as the reader. As the writer, I think it's the most valuable thing you can probably do and yet still taxing.
Maybe the way they should present it is to have the response before the commentaries, because in the response they asked me to cite each of the commentary, so I really present a synthetic view of the commentaries.
Yeah, but that's
anyway,
an idea.
That's an idea. So if you want to read it, maybe it's better to start with the response.
Well, yeah, I wanted your take on it because I've read many of those articles, and it's a common theme that's frustrating as a reader. It's just some people just want to advance their own ideas.
I've read other papers in BBS, like Kevin Oregon's paper, for example, on sensory motor theory of perception. And it's interesting to see also the different views that exist in the community, the diversity of views that people have. Even if you disagree with them or don't find them relevant, it's interesting to see that they exist. And that's something that you typically don't see in the literature, especially on broad issues like this.
That's right. No, I mean, in principle, I think it's a wonderful format. And, you enjoyed the process, correct?
Yeah, it was a bit painful though, but I think I'm happy about the results, let's say.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the results. So the paper is called "Is Coding a Relevant Metaphor for the Brain?" So let's say let's say I'm a monkey neurophysiologist, because I was. Let's say I wheel my monkey in his chair into the lab. I put him in front of a screen and show him some images, and I'm recording neurons while he looks at those images. And I can tell every time when he sees a giraffe, because the neuron that I'm recording starts firing a lot whenever a giraffe appears on the screen. So that means that neuron is encoding giraffes, right?
Right. Exactly. So here you're referring to the technical sense of code. That is to say, there's a correspondence between two things. One thing in the world, or stimulus parameter, something like that, and something that you measure in the brain. So there is a correspondence, and you call that code, in the same sense that there is a correspondence in the Morse code between letters and dots and dashes. And so far, it's fine. I mean, it's just one word that you use to talk about correspondences. But the problem is that very quickly we use there's a drift between this technical sense and different senses which are much broader than that. Because in the sense of a correspondence, saying that a neuron encodes stimulus doesn't mean much. It's not very relevant. You could say also, an example that I gave in a paper, that rain encodes atmospheric pressure. You could say, any two things that covary, you can say it's a code. But when we say this neuron encodes giraffe, we mean a little bit more than that, probably. And I say probably, but very often it's explicit, in fact. What we mean is that the brain is using this code to form an image of the giraffe, a representation of that giraffe, to know that there is a giraffe that he's looking at. The problem is that there is no logical implication between these two senses, the technical sense of correspondence and the sense of representation.
And by correspondence, you mean a correlation between the two things? Right,
just a correlation. Yeah, correspondence would be maybe the strong version, but of course can be statistical. Yeah, so there's this, most often the representational sense is something that is implied when we use code.
It's not even implied. We write it. I remember writing some, the neural activity represents whatever the psychological phenomenon was, and getting back responses. You can't use represents there because for the same reasons that we were talking about.
The subtlety is that we use the term represents represents, for example, but there is always this ambiguity about who is the target of this representation. Because of course this neuron's activity represents the giraffe for you, the neurophysiologist. The more difficult question is whether it represents something for the monkey. And this is much more difficult to assess. And so, there's this drift here when we we make this confusion between the observer's perspective and the organism's perspective. Even the term perspective might be actually confusing, but...
Sure. In the paper, you call this semantic drift, which is...
Semantic drift.
A shifting of the meaning from correlation, correspondence, like you said, to more... to larger claims like representation and causality, which we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah. Yeah, and this semantic drift you find in the coding metaphor, but also more generally in scientific writings quite often, is we use technical terms like information. I mean, technically, they have a very precise and limited sense, but we also use the term information when much more broadly in a way that has little to do with Shannon theory.
Well, so let's go ahead and just talk about information for a moment, because this comes up in the paper. And so when people say information, typically we can assume that they mean Shannon information, I suppose, but there are other alternative definitions of information that people use. I mean, there's the colloquial, information as in, I don't even know how to describe it, So the nice thing about Shannon information is that it's a very specific meaning about communicating messages between a sender and receiver. And the issue there is that the sender and receiver both have a set of possible messages that could be being communicated. So they're both sort of external observers in that sense. And I mean, maybe you can elaborate on this, but as you were just saying, the coding metaphor and the sense of representation implies that there is someone for whom the representation, someone who has a perspective for whom the representation exists. And your point is that is the experimenter, because I know that the giraffe is on the screen, so I know that the activity of the neuron is, quote unquote, representing that giraffe. But the monkey in this example would need already a representation of the giraffe, a set of possible messages, the giraffe being one, for that neural activity to be representing the giraffe in their mind. Maybe you can unpack all of that instead of me just rambling on here.
Yeah. So information in communication theory is a very specific kind of information, as you explained. So the activity of that monkey neuron would be informative that there is a giraffe, in the sense that there is a correspondence between the activity of that neuron and the presence of the giraffe. Yeah, more generally, you have also graded correspondences. For example, one example that I know well is in sound localization. You have neurons whose activity, like the firing rate, for example, co-varies with the position of the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you see this firing rate, you can deduce the position of the sound. But one thing that we'd easily forget in discussions about information is that in such correspondences there are always not two things but three things. There's the position of the sound source, there's the firing rate, but there's also the correspondence between the two, the mapping.
Mm.
And to deduce one of these three things, you need to have the two others, not just one. So if you just have the firing rate, you have nothing really. You just have some neuron blinking, basically. So to deduce the position of the sound source, you would need also to know the mapping. But that an organism would know this mapping makes little sense, in fact, because it's a mapping between something in the brain and something in the world. It cannot be something that the organism possesses. It's just a description that the observer makes. So this makes this type of information relevant maybe for an observer to quantify certain relations between observable variables, but it's not the kind of observation that is relevant for an organism in terms of perception. And it's not the only meaning we give to information in general. For example, you could say that if you read a physics textbook, you learn some things, you're going to get some information about the world.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
What kind of information are we talking about there? Is it something that we can quantify in a number of bits? That's not what it's about. The kind of information we get is a relation between different kind of things in the world. It's things that you can do in the world and expectations that you would get from that. It's not in terms of Shannon theory. It's not what we mean here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a perspective that is probably more relevant for an organism. What kind of information does an organism need? Well, it doesn't need to know, for example, that the sound is at 2.5 radian on the right of its nose. Probably not. But what it needs to know is that if it turns its eyes in a certain way, it will probably see something moving. And so this notion of information is a notion that is relational. It's not a number, it's a relation between things, different things you can do, for example, and the expectations of your sensory signals, this kind of things.
In the sense of turning, so there's a sound, and for the organism to know if I take this action, I might see something moving. Would it be accurate to say that in the relational information sense, if I turn my head, I will be toward the direction of perhaps seeing something moving, instead of I will turn my head 2.7 radians, and that is the place where I will see something moving? Am I off track there, thinking that the relational sense of information then is more of a directional, a gradient-based, rather than a calculate the angle at which the fly will be flying near me to reach out with my tongue and grab it, for instance?
There are 2 points, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
First, information for an organism cannot be in the sense of a reference to something that is outside the organism. This is the first thing, because it's outside the organism, so that reference is only useful for someone else. So that's the first thing. So if you say that this firing rate encodes the sound location because I can deduce the angle from it, you're missing something. Right. By relational, the relational view of information, what I mean is that information in the sense of, say, the laws of physics, for example, is not a set of values. It's relations. For example, the relations between different properties of a gas, the law of gas, of perfect gases, where you have different relations, which is PV equals nRT, okay? That's an information you have about properties of gases. It's not a value, right? It's just some relations that exist between things. In sound localization, for example, you have relations such as, this sound wave arrives 1 millisecond later than this other sound wave. Things like that. You have different relations. Other types of relations are sensory motor relations. If I make this movement, I expect these sensory signals to be such and such.
Part of your point is that the movement itself is crucial in that accounting. The information has to do with specifically if I make this movement. I mean, that is because that's internal to the organism, correct?
You can also have relations that are purely sensory, like in pitch perception, for example.
Right.
Sounds that evoke a pitch are sounds that are periodic, basically. So the relation that there is in those kind of sounds are periodicity. So they follow a certain law, and that's something that you can observe if you just see the wave, basically. And so there are relations that you can observe, which are sensory. So you have different kinds of relations, sensory relations or relations with your own movements and things like that. Right, but in any case, what you get is something that has structure. And that's something that cannot be captured by tuning curves, for example. Often, especially in sensory neuroscience, maybe it's less the case now, but a lot of sensory neuroscience has been, in terms of tunings of neurons to different properties. But that cannot work.
That's almost legacy, though, from recording single neurons and presenting a bunch of different conditions. And like you just said, it is changing with the multi-electrodes these days, where you're measuring a lot of different things, a lot of different neurons at once. I mean, tuning curves are still very prevalent, but...
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's changing so much. I mean, you can make tuning curves multidimensional. It's still the same problem.
Yeah.
So the problem with tuning curves is that they are about variables. But the variable only exists if you have defined the object. For example, the orientation of a bar exists once you have defined that there is a bar.
That's right.
And same for sound sources. There must be a source. All these ideas of inferring parameters, properties of things in the world, it's not that they're not relevant, but they are conditional of first having built a world. That is, you need to have objects for them to have properties that you will infer. And that's a very important part of perception that is dismissed in this approach. The formation of objects and scene analysis, things that you find in Gestalt theory, for example, but that has completely disappeared in the kind of tuning curve approaches. And these are, to me, the difficult parts of perception. How is it that a bunch of pixels is an object? I don't think pixels is right here, but anyway.
Yep.
So in perception, there must be, in information in general, there must be a notion of structure, relations between things. And so in the neural coding literature, you don't see that.
So you've called this relation, this relational aspect of information, like the laws in physics, you call this subjective physics. The idea that there are laws that relate the sensory signals, specifically with actions.
Not specifically, but yes. Yes, it's an analogy which I'm certainly not the first one to make between science and perception. That is to say that, so in science, you're trying to look for relations between observables and also between things that you can do and observables, that is, experiments. And for an organism, there is something similar in that, you want to know what would happen if you do certain things. So you want, that's the analog of an experiment. If I make such and such actions, what would happen in terms of the sensory signals, for example? You could also say, we can also observe some relations, as I mentioned before, between different kinds of sensory signals. For example, this event and this other event have some similarity or some relation to each other, and things like that. So there are laws that an organism can observe. There's something a little bit homuncular here, but...
Something what? Sorry?
Bit homuncular here. Is
homuncular,
that,
okay.
When I say that the organism observes sensory signals.
Sure. You can't avoid all language issues.
I put it aside for now, but it's a little bit of a problem. But anyway, it's... So you imagine that you have a certain number of sensory signals and you can make some actions where you can gain some knowledge by observing relations between sensory signals and relations between actions and sensory signals. And this idea you find in different authors. One is Kevin Oregon with the sensory motor theory of perception. You also have Gibson, of course. Gibson, probably one of the first authors that really made me think deeply about these issues, and who is not properly understood by computational neuroscientists, I think.
Not properly understood or properly appreciated? Or both?
Both, I think. In part because of confusion on the words, information and things like that.
But you like his idea of affordances and that.
So affordances is the most affordance is the most known concept of Gibson.
Yeah.
And it's obviously an important concept. But in fact, what I I found really interesting at the time when I read his book was the concept of invariant structure. And so he says there is information in the invariant structure in sensory flow. And what he means by that is that when you move your head, for example, it was mainly working on vision, but it works also for audition and others. When you move your head, when you move in the world, the sensory signals change, but the change in the way that is highly structured, because these signals come from a world which follows the laws of physics, and so there is structure in this sensory flow, which you could say is the projection of these laws of physics on your organs, and so there is some structure, projective structure, etc.
As you change, it progresses in accordance with those physical laws, but it's dependent on your changing and moving and acting. Yeah,
and it also takes a form that is specific of your own perspective,
which makes it internal and not dependent on an external observer, which is the whole key of...
Yes. That's why, for example, he disagrees with the idea that we reconstruct the 3D structure of objects.
Like that what we're seeing, what we have internally is a perfect representation of the external world.
Yes, in the sense of, of physics, you would imagine that you have a bunch of atoms and they are laid out in 3D space, and that's what you're trying to reconstruct.
Right. You're in your internal model.
Yeah. But that's not what we do exactly, because he argues, and these are very, very simple arguments, you just have to open your eyes, basically, is that the visual world is a world of surfaces. It's not a 3D world exactly. It's a world of surfaces that reflect lights. And so what you see are surfaces, and so you get laws from your own perspective which are related to that. And but you don't really reconstruct 3D in the sense that you're making a 3D model, as in a virtual reality model.
Yeah, your own 3D printer in your head.
It's not exactly that, right? So anyway,
So we were at Gibson and invariances, and
yeah. So the idea of information as relations, and so there's Oregon, there's Gibson. Also find that way back in like a century ago in Poincaré, for example.
Mm-hmm. Charles Sanders Peirce, the pragmatists are touch this as well.
Yeah, pragmatism. So pragmatism is also related to the idea of affordances. We kind of digress here, but it questions what representation is supposed to, and what function it's supposed to fill, actually. And this is important because I mentioned before that one problem with the coding metaphor, and why it is a metaphor, is that we use it in a technical sense, but then we actually use it also in a more representational sense without demonstrating the link, basically.
We claim representation when what we've done is correlation or correspondence.
That's right. Yeah. And my point in the paper is not to say that there are no representations. Some reviewers have interpreted in this way.
Yeah, that's interesting.
In fact, it's a little bit the opposite. Not exactly, but my point is rather that a neural code, doesn't have the properties that would make it a good representation or meaningful representation for an organism. And in fact, if I could make a specific criticism to the use of the neural coding metaphor, is that they don't take representation seriously. In the sense that we say that some neuron's activity represents a giraffe or something like that, just on the basis that there is a correlation between the existence of a giraffe and this activity. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there's a lot of literature on representation in cognitive science and philosophy of science and philosophy of mind, and a representation is not just that. Representation is supposed to fulfill some function and to have some very specific properties, and to demonstrate those properties is not trivial. Why do we think there are mental representations in the first place? Well, there are different arguments for representations. One argument is that, well, we behave in the world and we also perceive things, and this seems to happen in our brain. Well, the activity of our neurons, but it's about something that is outside our brain. And so there's this intuition that we're using representations that are somehow determined by the environment, but at the same time accessible to the organism. So one of the very important properties of representation is that it has to be something intrinsically accessible by the organism. And that's something that a code is not, first thing. A code is not accessible to the organism because it's defined on the basis of a correspondence with something outside the brain, and only on that correspondence. So that's the first problem. And a second property of representations, why would we need representations at all, is some form of abstraction, I would say. For example, I'll take again the example of sound localization.
Okay.
You have, for example, a cat. It's in the grass, and it's listening to some noise. It's a mouse scratching the grass, and then it hears that, and it goes to the source of the sound. It eats the mouse. What is very interesting about that is that when you look at the sound waves that arrive at the ears of the cat, well, there's no direct indication of where the mouse is, and the mouse is scratching the grass. It makes different sounds. The sound waves are different, but the position of the source is still the same. And so the cat seems to behave as a function of something that doesn't depend directly on the sound waves, but something that is more abstract, something that is invariant to many aspects of the sounds. Well, what sound exactly it is only seems to depend on where the sound comes from. And that's why we think, well, the cat uses some kind of representation of where the sound comes from, and uses that to do some action. And it could also, with sounds coming from the same position, it could decide to flee if the cat thinks it's something threatening or depends on the cat's state. So with the same sensory signals, the cat could do different actions, and it does these actions as a function of something quite abstract, something that has invariances to intensity or to the precise thing that the mouse is doing. So if we want to show that something is a representation of sound location, what you need to do is not just that in your experiment there was a correlation between the position of the source that you moved and some measurements that you make. You need to show that it's a representation of sound location. You have to show that this thing actually doesn't depend on something else. It's not going to be completely different if you change the pitch of the sound, or if you change whatever.
The time of day.
Otherwise, you're not talking about a representation of sound location. You're just talking about some correlation between two measurements. That's all. And and the third property of representation, and maybe the key property of representation that you will find in the philosophical literature, is that a representation must be verifiable. It can be right or it can be wrong.
Mm-hmm. You need to have, this is called system detectable error.
That's Bicard's phrase, yeah. Bicard says that a representation must have a truth value,
possible
truth value that can be assessed by the organism itself. For example, for the cat, well, the cat can run, and then it will find the mouse and eat it or not. So the representation will be correct or it will not be correct.
Mm-hmm.
There's a way here to say whether the representation is correct or not for the organism.
But outside of the organism's own action in trying to get the mouse, outside of the cat performing that action, there is no way internally to say whether that representation was correct.
Exactly. That's the problem with the coding view of representation, is that it is based on an idea of representation that is not verifiable by the organism, by the receiving end. Therefore, it's not a representation for the organism. It's a representation for the observer.
Mm-hmm.
It's the painting kind of representation. You know, you make a painting of some scene. It's a representation of that scene, in the sense that you can look at the painting and you can look at the scene and check whether they match in some aspects. But of course, that works only if you can look at the two.
That's right.
But the brain cannot look at its own activity and at something outside itself. It's there's a problem here with this notion.
But your subjective sense or my subjective experience, if I'm going to turn and eat the mouse, is I do see it as a painting. I see it as a world model, as if I have a model of the world. I see it as a 3D model of the world. And maybe the only way out of that is to say that we do have internal models of actions that we can compare against, and that eventually we end up subjectively experiencing these things. I know that you avoided consciousness as a topic really in the paper, but it's related to the idea of representation because it seems like something, and that something it seems like is not the way that you're describing the way that representation truly works internal to the organism. I wonder if you could touch on that.
On consciousness?
Well, yeah, just the discrepancy between what our subjective sense of what representation is commonly thought of. So I can represent the mouse in the field, and I can imagine it, right? And I can have a subjective experience of thinking of that mouse 2.7 radians behind me, or whatever. But if that doesn't match to the way we actually are, quote unquote, representing, the way that representation necessarily has to happen for us to have a representation and for it not to be a representation for an external observer. I guess what I'm saying is the subjective sense is as if you are an external observer to that representation.
Yeah. So the problem with representation is not so much. The problem with code is not, as I say, so much with the problem of representation. I mean,
right.
There is a case for mental representations in some sense, which, at least in some pragmatic sense, that was actually what the cat example illustrated. That is to say that the cat has some representation of where the mouse is, in the sense that it can go there at some
potentially go and get
some position and then get it, and so it has this truth value. In this sense, it can be a representation, but it doesn't have to be a thing that you have in the brain that you can look at. That's the main issue with encoding. Mm-hmm. You can think of representations in terms of the desired properties that biological organisms do have. All these, acting as a function of abstractions and expectations and things like that. But it doesn't have to be a thing that the brain is looking at. So there's something I touch upon, in fact, related to consciousness in my response, which is that, as you say, we have this intuition that we have representations because of our consciousness. We experience something about the world, but it's in us. And so the intuition is that since this is generated by our brains, and if we're materialist, we must believe that there must be some mapping between the state of our brain and the mental representation. And this, I think, is misleading intuition. So I gave a thought experiment in my response. Do you know the TV series Bewitched?
Oh, yeah, Bewitched. That's right. I remember this example when she wrinkles her nose and blinks or something, and everyone freezes.
Did
while
you know
she
this
continues
TV series?
Unfortunately, I watched too much television as a child, so yes.
Okay, yeah, all right. So okay, there's this witch in disguise, she's a housewife, and so she can twitch her nose, and when she does that, the world freezes, and so she can do different things and solve different problems, and then she unfreezes, and the world keeps on as if nothing happened. Now the question is, what happens during the time when the world is frozen to the person whose brains are frozen?
Military guy, wasn't he? The man of the house was I can't remember the character. Anyway, what happens to him when he's frozen and she's solving problems?
Yeah. During that time, is he just experiencing the same thing during all that time? Perceiving something, but just for a long time? It doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right. You would think that actually what happens is just he hadn't noticed, and it's for him, really, that event just didn't happen, in fact.
Just like as he experienced in the show, like it didn't happen.
Right. But if you think that, there must be a mapping between the state of the brain and what you're experiencing, then that's what you should think, though. And what this suggests to me is that experiencing, it's a verb, experiencing or representing is an activity.
A process.
It's a process. It's not something, it's not a painting.
In fact, there's no such thing as a painting.
Right. Even a painting. You look at a painting, it's an activity again. So I think it's just wrong to look for something like a painting in the brain. There is no painting that we'll look at. It's just the activity. And so maybe to think in terms of representation, we should perhaps think in terms of properties of that we are looking for in the system. Those properties like abstract properties, expectations, these kind of properties, anticipatory properties, etc.
This is related to the notion of a process versus substance metaphysics, which
yes.
maybe I'm not sure we have time to really get into, but this is from, again, Bickhard's
right.
work, which I know you're fond of, and you made me go down the rabbit hole and read a bunch of his work, so thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea then is to think of representations as processes, and, well, briefly, the process versus substance metaphysics is the notion, the difference between that there are things in the world, particles, atoms, versus there are not things, there are processes in the world. There are the processes by which we call atoms and the things that we see. And we live generally we sort of assume in our daily lives that the world is made up of substances, of things, when it could be made up of processes. And it's hard to wrap my head around it, but in the past year or so, I keep revisiting in this idea and thinking it's more and more correct that there's no such thing as nouns, there are only verbs.
Yeah. I think it's the key point, probably. And it's not just about perception and representation and all that. I think it's whole biology. If you take a cell, a neuron, even though we say a neuron lasts 8 years or so, well, everything that constitutes the neuron has changed many, many, many times over that duration.
The Heraclitean neuron.
There's turnover. It takes over a few days or maybe weeks. All the proteins have been replaced. Mm-hmm. It's really a dynamic thing. When you really look at it, you just don't realize it, but it's a dynamic thing. And even something like a ionic channel, it's some form of abstraction. You have processes that involve proteins and different things in the cell, and it's dynamic. And to understand a cell, you need to understand the organization of those processes rather than the stuff that they are made of.
That's right. This is challenging.
this is challenging. It's related to the point that we discussed previously about Frankenstein models. That's related really to this substance metaphysics. We think that, well, there is the sodium channel, there is the potassium channel, I put them together, I get a neuron.
Right.
But by doing that, you dismiss the organization of processes. The fact that there's all these channels, they are related to each other by different processes, which implies that their properties are in fact related. And these are things that we know, in fact, that has been documented. And the challenge is to think in terms of the organization of the cell, the dynamic organization of the cell, rather than the substances that a cell is made of.
Well, okay, so I know that we have very few moments left here, and there are two questions I would like to ask you if you have time.
Yeah.
We'll do. So one is just, so the coding metaphor, let's just say you're right, that it's a problem. Yet, neuroscience, let's say, has made tremendous progress. Eventually, it will run up against a wall, right? But it's interesting that we have been able to make so much progress under a false metaphor. And I wonder, well, what you think about that. Isn't it wild that we can do so much under such false assumptions and metaphors?
That's a difficult question. I mean, yes and no, we've made progress, but what kind of progress?
Well, we can...
I still personally have no idea what perception is.
But who cares if you understand what perception is, as long as we can help people with dementia? You know, for instance,
okay,
right?
But that's a completely different question, because you can cure people without having any idea how the drug works. So that's not really the issue here.
Maybe not drugs. Let's say you could, under a coding metaphor, potentially stimulate neurons in a very particular pattern to give someone relief from their anxiety, for instance, right? And only having gone this far under the coding metaphor from Hubel and Wiesel on up, right?
You know, I'm not sure Hubel and Wiesel committed the coding metaphor, in fact, when you look at the papers.
Yeah, okay. I'm just saying because let's not get into a diatribe about the history, you know, but from, let's say Barlow, for instance, right? You know, would that make you happier, Barlow?
Well, if you look at Barlow, that's interesting because in his early papers, he talked about coding in the retina, mostly, and he makes it very clear that it's just one particular perspective. So it's fine to use metaphors, in fact, as long as you're aware that it is one and you're aware of the limitations. Metaphors or analogies more generally.
Analogies, yeah.
They are very useful scientifically. They help you think, develop concepts. It's not a problem in itself. What's the problem is to confuse the analogy with the real thing. So it's a particular perspective on the system. In the case of Barlow, he was looking at the retina. And in the case of the retina, there are some arguments to use a communication metaphor. I can think of two. One is that you have things that belong to two different domains. One is light, and the other is ionic currents, the biological domain. And there's an interface where these things need to be translated somehow.
Yeah.
And I'm using linguistic metaphor again. And so there is a case for using communication ideas for transduction. There's also a case for using communication ideas when you think of the optic nerve. The optic nerve creates a bottleneck where you have to, it's very difficult not to use those metaphors, but I can use them. I'm comfortable using them.
As long as you wink when you say it.
Exactly. You have this bottleneck. You have the eye is in the front of your head, and the visual cortex is in the back, and so you have to convey all this information.
Yes, he's doing air quotes. Yes,
you can't air quotes exactly from the retina to the visual cortex. There is a a case for using communication metaphor because there is a communication issue. But then using communication metaphor once you're in the cortex becomes much more questionable. Who are you talking to? Who's the brain is talking to exactly? That's a bit problematic. I mean, in the case of the retina, well, it's mostly one way. It goes from the retina to the cortex. Okay, maybe a few things back, but not much. It's mainly one directional. Yeah, so you could. It's a perspective that has some value. But when you just take one neuron in the middle of the cortex, that's a bit more difficult to make the case. So yeah, I don't think using metaphors is a problem in itself. It's just that when it becomes so widespread that it seems that you can't do any science without using it, then it's a problem.
It's interesting. Go ahead.
And Barlow, in fact, in his papers, talked about the idea of efficient coding, but he also explicitly mentioned other possible hypotheses. One talking about what these neurons are doing, like detection, and I don't remember exactly, another perspective is control, for example, and it's a completely different perspective.
Right, back from the cybernetics movement which is
exactly. Yep. He just thought that in his case, it was a good perspective, basically, but it doesn't mean that it's a universal perspective on perception or on the brain.
I mean, it's interesting. Claude Shannon himself even wrote a piece warning against taking his sense of information, which he had seen explode into all other domains of science, and everyone was talking about Shannon information. He wrote just a very short piece warning people, this is not the only sense of information, and it's not applicable to all domains. We don't heed those sorts of warnings. We just move forward with what we see as successful metaphors, I suppose.
Yeah, I even quoted a review which said that Shannon information is basically the only good definition or formal definition of information.
Like Gallistel? Are you talking about Randy?
No. I'm sorry, I forgot. It's in the paper, but I forgot. Okay. I forgot who it was. I disagree with that.
It's happened again. We've only gotten to about a quarter of the things that I wanted to talk about, but this has been a lot of fun, and hopefully it's just a good teaser for people to go and read your paper and be introduced to the rest of your work in your blog, for instance. So I know you have to go pick up your child. I have to go make my child breakfast, my children. I only make
of course.
breakfast for one child at a time.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate the time, and hopefully we can do this again because there's lots more to talk about.
Sure.
We didn't even get to talk about AI, which I was going to ask you about. So. But
okay.
Continue the good work, man, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Brain Inspired is a production of me and you. I don't do advertisements. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling amount and get access to the full versions of all the episodes, plus bonus episodes that focus more on the cultural side but still have science. Go to braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.